Let's go ahead and get started. It's five after. I see there's only two of you, two workshop participants on, and we didn't have any requests for a specific topic, or nothing kind of clearly came out as something to speak about this week. Um, from the review of the projects. So we really decided to just go ahead and hold this as kind of open Q&A. So for the two of you that are on, I'm just going to ask if you guys have any questions, and we'll start from there.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Is that Erica?
Yeah, this is Erica. So I guess one topic that I was curious about was around programming for low-end devices, just because kind of in our day-to-day, we're used to kind of, or for the most part, we're used to building with the luxury of knowing, you have a high-speed internet connection, you've got, all these computer resources. In terms of testing, I guess I was curious, is it what's the best way to go about testing on devices? Yeah.
That's a good question. What we found is that we do eventually test on actual lower end devices that we have, in the office. We understand that most of you probably don't have access to, may not have access to an Android device at all. And if you do, it's probably one that's not one of the lower end ones. So, for the sake of the workshop, we're not kind of requiring people to have tested it on, a plethora of low end devices. I can give you a little bit of insight is things that we've seen that have been an issue on lower end devices. Although I will say that as I'm sure you're aware, the speed with which even the low end devices are accelerating is such that what was a low end device that you wanted to accommodate 2 years ago was basically no longer around anymore, and what was a high end device 2 years ago is now a low end device. So the areas where we've seen the kind of biggest issue is frankly less around processing speed and more about memory. And in the apps that we've been developing and working with, a lot of that has to do with the weight of the graphics assets. And fortunately, that's something that you can typically scale down, which is when we have graphics assets produced, we might produce those at a very high resolution, and we have animations done at a higher frame rate, but then we'll downsample those to lower sizes or have animations done with a much smaller number of frames. And that makes a big difference as to how much time it takes to load in the assets and how quickly it plays it back. So if you've started, remind me again of which project you're working on.
Sure. So I'm working on the Pick One of X.
Okay.
Interaction.
So have you spent any time looking at? I know we recently made available the open source code around some of the work we've done in React Native that Micah has led.
We've been I've been playing around with some of the example code and kind of tinkering around with that and getting to know.
So there's a lot of assets there too, and you'll get a sense of kind of how there's a relatively small number of frames for the animations that the characters go through. That it's really almost like a small sequence of poses that they go in between instead of really fluid animation. And that's in great part to keep the amount of assets that need to be loaded or played low, so it's not using up a lot of working memory. That's probably the primary thing that we've kind of focused on in terms of dealing with the low-end devices. Stephanie, when you guys have surveyed a bunch of the apps that are out there and we have them on them, are there particular apps that you found were heavyweight and didn't work well on the low end devices?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear
Okay.
you.
Yeah. So usually, well, what has usually happened is that if we found that they didn't, we just screened them in house, and then we didn't really send them out. But yeah, anything that's too graphics heavy. Although I'd say right now we're testing this app, Feed the Monster, which works beautifully on Android devices, and it's very graphics heavy. So there must, I think it's possible to do something that's, that it requires a lot of graphics that does quite well.
Yeah, although
but we haven't put that out in the field yet.
At least in terms of, I don't know how extensive you guys have tested on the lower end devices yet, but yeah. that app is very much the way that animation assets are set up is as sprite sheets. And they're fairly low resolution, so it's easy to load them.
Okay, so maybe that's the key. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the advantage to doing something as a set of sprites or sprite sheets is that you can very easily downsample those and get it to something that try to find that sweet spot between performance versus appearance. Does that help answer your question, Erica?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Is there anybody else have any other burning questions or any questions for that matter?
Kind of this is Audrey. As a follow-up a little bit to that, I'm doing the Tap and Explore app with letters.
Yeah.
And I was actually just today trying to figure out if it would be better to just have like letter buttons versus having actual like images of letters.
Yep.
For them to tap on, but it didn't seem as exciting if they're just like a plain letter. So your kind of thoughts on that would be great.
So, the convention for those of us who aren't kind of kids is sometimes to think that the things that we want kids to touch have to look like their traditional interface elements, like buttons. That's really not true for two reasons. One, kids will just try touching everything.
Yep.
And two is that in a lot of cases in the developing countries, we're working with kids who haven't been enculturated to what user interfaces are supposed to look like anyhow. So I think it's probably, your instinct's correct, which is that it's probably more important to make something that's attractive that will perk their curiosity and they'll excite them to touch it or to at least explore. And so I think it becomes more of a design question between what's friendly in that regard in terms of what looks like any kind of conventional user interface. I do think that the feedback that's typically given to you when you touch something to let you know that the device is responding to your touch, that it's acknowledged your touch, that usually comes twofold. One is something visually changes underneath and around your finger where your finger touched. So it goes into some sort of highlight or touched state. It coupled with some sort of audio feedback is still very important. And that could be, it could be a glow or some visual highlight, or it could be some little animation loop that plays around the character, and or audio, or all of the above. So does that speak to it? And then in your case, what you're trying to have it do is not only it's also probably revealing something too, right? So
right.
I have to admit, I don't remember what your kind of layout and your wireframes were, but there's somewhere there's probably space made to where when a kid touches a particular letter, there's some additional, it brings up some additional images or animation or sounds that correlate to that letter. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, that helps.
Yeah, it really is. It's remarkable how kids will just, just beat the hell out of the front of the screen, touching everything to see what happens. So it's kind of hard. It's pretty much impossible to curb that kind of impulse.
So I guess I have a question around the typical kind of age of kids for your deployments. Are they typically around a similar age group, or do you see a lot of like a wide variety?
You want to take that, Stephanie?
Sure. So it depends a little bit on the kind of deployment that we have. So we tend to see a much tighter age group if we're working in a school or a preschool or an after-school program. So obviously in preschools, we don't have many 3-year-olds using our apps. But 4, 5, 6, because say for instance in Uganda, kids don't go to first grade until 7. So 4, 5, and 6 would be the age group that would use our apps. And in a school setting, in say for instance South Africa, the US, Peru, you see 5 to 7 as the typical age group, up to 9 years old depending upon the reading levels of the kids. In a setting where you are giving the tablets to kids who don't have access to school, then you're going to see a much broader age range, anywhere from 4, potentially 11, but probably from 4-ish to 9-ish. So I think if you're planning for an audience that's between the ages of 5 and 7, you're getting a good sweet spot.
It is really, in some ways, it's more focused on the developmental stage or the level they're at with their reading skills than it is age.
Yeah, we are really trying to hit, eventually hit all levels of reading ability, but you need to start at the beginning. So yeah, Tinsley's right. We are more concerned about making sure that we have these early stages of both pre-literacy as well as the first few stages of becoming literate covered, regardless of age.
Have you ever run into a scenario where you have a group of older students where where they've been kind of put off by the design because maybe it's been kind of designed with a younger audience in mind?
Well, that's a great question. In the places where we've seen older children using the apps, it's actually the older children who are probably, more engaged for longer periods of time.
Okay.
I think part of the reason that is A, they're more motivated. B, they are older, so just developmentally they have a longer attention span. And the third reason is a lot of our apps were quite simple in design. It's another reason to keep the apps quite simple, because then you are really geared more towards keeping the content engaging, and not using kind of very age specific trickery to keep young children engaged.
I think it's a very good question, and I'd have to say I don't know that we have a ton of data to really understand how this would work with an older group, or even for that matter with illiterate adults who are trying to learn, whether they would be put off by this or still use it. But we do have a few kind of anecdotal things that from our experience in working the field. One is that we've seen in situations where the devices are available to a kid 24 hours a day, in a situation where parents are questionably literate, we see usage at hours in the night when kids typically wouldn't be using them.
Yeah.
which is interesting. The other thing is that in a lot of the developing country situations, there's not this kind of social and family conditioning that certain things are young, are for little kids and not for older kids, and so I shouldn't be doing them. And in great part because they just don't have a lot of experience with the devices, and in part because just culturally that isn't built into their society. So we haven't overly concerned ourselves with the concern that what we're designing is something that only younger kids would want to use. We may be proven wrong about that in the future, but we haven't been overly concerned about it today.
That's awesome.
That answer?
Yeah.
Is there? I'll give you guys another minute or two to think about if there's anything else and to absorb what we just talked about, and then we'll decide if we're going to continue it. Stephanie, was there anything from the review of materials that you've looked at over the last week that suggested that there were any topics you wanted to speak to? Particularly?
No, I see people actually making really great decisions about what content that they want to focus on, and really thinking about what aspect of reading. I can't wait to start seeing the apps, though. I mean, that's going to be fun.
Yeah. Audrey and Erica, is there anything more from the two of you?
No, I think those are all the questions I had.
Okay, good. Well,
Yeah, me too.
Thank you guys for joining today. Glad you were able to, and thanks for your questions.
Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye.
Pleasure. Bye.